clack, and bridge match. The structure itself is recursive and fractal, which aligns with his thinking about complexity and permaculture. He shared 3 images without a specific question, which is typical of how he works, using me as a thinking partner to engage with his concept sketches. The most useful response would be to read back what I'm seeing accurately so he knows I've understood the note, then explore where these ideas might lead. The fractal recursion in the poem's structure mirrors its content. Each level spawns the next, enacting emergence through form itself. This connects to the phase transition thinking from today's session and the edge effect principle where boundaries become generative zones. David thinks in these systems natively, so I should engage with the formal moves he's making rather than offer surface praise, and likely start by confirming I've read the transcription accurately before riffing on what's emerging. The edge effect in permaculture mirrors his distinction-making framework. Boundaries are where generative action happens. The temporal collapse at the end, spatial coordinates dissolving into transience, captures the paradox of attractors, stable yet impermanent, which echoes Wu Wei. Click-clack bridge match feels like the sonic tactile moment of connection spawning new forms, and those micro-motions, squiggle, swirl, twirl, are the small-scale turbulences that amplify at edges. I'm noting the transcription details and thinking about how to respond warmly but substantively, connecting this back to his threshold work without over-explaining, keeping it tight and letting him steer where this goes next. Claude thinks, David wants me to push this toward its creative potential, and he's given me freedom to explore. This is fundamentally a poem about emergence and edge effects, the vocabulary mixing ecology with playful sound, and the cascading indentation already enacts the branching and spreading he's after. I'm thinking about how to develop the formal structure and language to deepen that sense of transience and attractor dynamics. The key is respecting David's sensibility. He's philosophically rigorous but spare, drawn to fractals and Taoist thinking, and he values the sonic playfulness in phrases like squiggle, swirl, twirl, and click-clack. I shouldn't over-explain or make it solemn. The poem should stay light and performative, letting the typography and sound carry the emergence rather than spelling it out. Since he's asking me to work this toward its creative end, I should actually write the finished poem rather than just analyze it. Given the scope, probably 30 to 50 lines with branching typography to enact the emergence arc, this warrants an artifact, especially since David archives and releases work CC0. I'm mapping out the poem's structure, starting with local conditions and substrate, moving through attractors where patterns begin to pool, then the combinatorial coupling that spawns new forms, and finally the emergent arrival, real but transient. The cascading indentation will perform the branching visually, while the sonic play, the squiggles and swirls, keeps that playful, generative edge alive throughout. The poem continues through the cascade of emergence, ideas spawning ideas, the form appearing unbidden, then pulls back to question whether that final couplet about the edge holding life is too didactic. I'm wondering if David would want it more shown than stated, though he does sometimes land on aphoristic turns. The tension I'm feeling is between completing the thought and letting it dissolve. The Wu Wei instinct is to resist over-determining the ending, to trust the reader with the transience rather than explaining it. Maybe the right move is to let the branching peak, let the form name itself as here, then dissolve into something that echoes gone later, without spelling out the thesis. On the practical side, I'm deciding whether this should be a single cascading poem or a 3-part sequence that mirrors the seed's movements. The single poem feels cleaner and more faithful. And there's the question of his spelling. Water has character as a field note, but for a finished piece I'd normalize it to water unless the idiosyncrasy is doing sonic work, which it isn't. The invented words though, squiggle, swirl, twirl, those are clearly intentional coinages and worth keeping. They're not errors, they're playful creations. Now I'm tightening the poem itself, cutting the throat-clearing intro and jumping straight in, the way David usually does. The revised version starts with the local conditions stacked and compressed, then moves into the paradox of nothing deciding while everything leans, and the water finding its own grooves. The ending lands on that final reversal. The edge was never the wall, it was the door, which has that compressed, quotable quality David does so well. It's clean, and maybe risks being too neat, but that compression and revelation is exactly his style. I'm questioning whether door is the right image, though. The edge effect in ecology isn't really architectural. It's a zone of mixing, a fertile band where the most life congregates. The hedgerow, the tide line, the riverbank, the mycelial margin. The image should be ecological rather than metaphorical. What if I strip away the metaphor reaching and stay with the ecological truth instead? Something like the edge was never the line between it was the place that made the most. Or maybe lean into his own vocabulary with the seam, which connects back to the seam cycle and his larger body of work, which could be exactly right or too on the nose. But the real question is what the poem is actually saying. Emergence happens at boundaries. The generative action lives at the edge, not in the homogeneous interior, and what emerges is real but impermanent. The Taoist core of it, don't grasp it, it's gone later, and that's fine because the edge will make another. So the ending needs to hold both the generativity and the transience together. Not triumph or neat reversal, but something that captures how the edge is inexhaustible precisely because nothing it makes stays. That emptiness, that yielding quality, that's the Wu Wei principle at work. The edge holds nothing, and that's exactly how it makes everything. It's paradoxical and compressed, true to his register, echoing back to empty to prey, maybe keeps making instead of makes to avoid overclaiming, though everything works as poetic license. The poem's taking shape at around 30 lines with the cascade structure, which feels substantial enough for an artifact. I should format it as a clean markdown file with a CC0 dedication, since that's David's standard practice for releasing work. He asked me to work it toward its creative end, meaning deliver the realized poem itself rather than exploring what it could become. so I'll keep my framing brief, just a sentence or two on the key choices I made with his language in the Taoist resolution, then present the artifact. I should use a markdown artifact since this is long-form creative content that the user will want to keep. For preserving the poem's indentation in Markdown, I'll need to be careful about how whitespace renders. Markdown can collapse leading spaces, so I might need to use a code block or find another approach to maintain the visual structure. ECTs, like nested block quotes or just accepting leading non-breaking spaces. Since the poem's visual cascade is essential, I need to preserve it. I'll use non-breaking spaces for indentation at each line start and explicit line breaks via backslash, which is more reliable than trailing spaces in the source. I'm weighing whether to use a fenced code block for exact whitespace preservation. It would look intentional for a systems piece but might feel too monospace for lyrical poetry. I'll stick with non-breaking space HTML entities and double-space line breaks between stanzas, constructing it carefully so the formatting renders properly. Settling on trailing spaces for line breaks, since that's the most reliable approach across Markdown renderers. I'll keep the structure simple with modest indentation using non-breaking spaces, then add a brief form note and CC0 dedication at the end. That's consistent with his practice and he can remove it if needed. Time to write the actual piece now, keeping my response concise. I'm adding the closing lines that complete the arc, the edge's impermanence and its generative power. The structure peaks at the deepest indentation with the cascading spawns, then resolves outward as the form emerges, finally settling into a Taoist meditation on presence and dissolution. Now I need to verify the text details. Roland should match his original phrasing, and I'll preserve his coinages like squirrel and twirl as written. I'm setting up the Markdown file with non-breaking spaces for indentation and hard line breaks to capture the visual shape of the poem. I'll use HTML tags for maximum compatibility, bra4 line breaks, and BSP for indentation. This approach renders reliably across different Markdown renderers while keeping the source readable. Writing the Markdown file.